I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what is your favourite song? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Music at the Assembly Rooms. The spring charity concert at St Mary Mead was one of those occasions that settled into the calendar with the inevitability of Easter or Michaelmas, and had done so for longer than anyone cared to remember. It took place, as it always did, on the third Saturday in April, when the evenings had grown light enough to walk home without a torch, but not so warm that ladies might forgo their wraps. The Assembly Rooms, a modest Georgian building that had weathered 2 centuries with dignity if not grandeur, stood at the corner of the high street, its tall windows glowing with a gentle amber light that seemed to promise both culture and respectability in equal measure. Miss Jane Marple, who had lived in St Mary Mead for more years than she generally admitted to, found herself seated in the 4th row, which was precisely where she expected to be. The front rows were reserved, as they had been for as long as she could recall, for those whose names appeared on committees, whose ancestors had endowed almshouses, or whose annual subscriptions to parish funds exceeded £10. Miss Marple, whose own contributions were necessarily modest, harboured no resentment about this arrangement. Indeed, she found the 4th row offered certain advantages. One could observe the front rows quite thoroughly, without appearing to stare, and one was far enough from the platform to allow for quiet conversation during the less engaging musical selections. This evening promised the usual fare. Miss Deborah Hartley would perform Chopin with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Colonel Melchit's niece would sing something German that nobody quite understood, and the vicar's wife would recite a portion of Wordsworth with that trembling sincerity that made everyone uncomfortable. But there was, Miss Marple had been given to understand, a surprise addition to the programme. A Mr. Emil Kraus, recently arrived in the village and lodging at Mrs. Pritchard's establishment on Orchard Lane, had consented to play the violin. Mrs. Pritchard herself, seated 2 rows ahead and slightly to the left, had mentioned this development to Miss Marple only that morning at the greengrocer's. She had done so with that particular combination of pride and uncertainty that landlords often display when discussing lodgers who are genteel but perhaps not quite what one might wish. A very quiet gentleman, so I see, as Mrs. Pritchard had confided, selecting carrots with unnecessary deliberation, pays his rent promptly, keeps regular hours, and asks nothing beyond his meals and a bit of a coal for the fire. He's been with me since February, you know. Came down from London, I believe, though he doesn't say much about his circumstances. And he plays the violin, Miss Marple had inquired gently. Oh, beautifully, Miss Marple, beautifully, though one does wonder. Mrs. Pritchard had hesitated, her fingers hovering over a bunch of spring onions. That is to say, it does seem rather unusual, doesn't it? A gentleman of his age, living alone, no family to speak of, and the accent, you know, foreign, though he speaks English perfectly well. One can't help but wonder what brings a man like that to a place like St Mary Mead. Miss Marple had made a non-committal sound that might have meant anything, and the conversation had moved on to the more pressing matter of whether the new potatoes were worth the extra expense. Now, settling into her seat with her programme neatly folded in her lap, Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Pritchard's observations were not perhaps entirely without foundation. St Mary Mead was not the sort of village that attracted strangers, particularly not cultured, middle-aged gentlemen with foreign accents and no visible means of employment. People came to St Mary Mead because they had been born there, or because they had family there, or because they wished to retire somewhere respectable and inexpensive. They did not come, as a rule, simply to lodge at Mrs. Pritchard's and play the violin. The lights dimmed slightly and a hush fell over the assembly. Mrs. Angela Fortescue, chairwoman of the Cultural Committee, and a woman whose sense of social hierarchy was as finely calibrated as a Swiss watch, rose from her seat in the front row and made her way to the platform. She was a tall woman in her middle 50s, dressed this evening in dark blue silk that whispered expensively as she moved. Her late husband had been something in the city, Miss Marple recalled, and had left her comfortably situated with a large house on the edge of the village and an assured position in all matters cultural and charitable. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Fortescue began, her voice carrying the sort of refined authority that comes from years of committee work and parish influence. "How delightful to see so many of you here this evening in support of our village hospital fund. As you know, we have prepared a most varied programme for your enjoyment, featuring many of our own talented residents." She paused, allowing a ripple of polite anticipation to pass through the room. "However, I am particularly pleased to announce a special addition to this evening's entertainment. Mr. Emil Kraus, who has recently joined our village community, has most graciously agreed to share his considerable musical gifts with us. Mr. Kraus studied at the Vienna Conservatory and has performed throughout Europe. We are most fortunate to have him among us." The applause that followed was measured, as befitted an English village audience that had not yet decided what it thought of this new addition to its ranks. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Fortescue's smile, though warm, did not quite reach her eyes. There was something in the set of her shoulders, in the way she emphasised the word fortunate, that suggested a certain reservation beneath the courtesy. Mr. Kraus himself appeared from the side of the platform with the quiet, unhurried movements of someone accustomed to performing. He was perhaps 50 years of age, of medium height, with iron-grey hair brushed back from a high forehead and a lean, ascetic face that might have belonged to a scholar or a priest. His evening clothes, though perfectly correct, had the slightly worn look of garments that had seen better days, and there was something in his bearing, a careful dignity, a watchfulness about the eyes, that spoke of experiences not entirely happy. He bowed slightly to the audience, acknowledged Mrs. Fortescue with a small inclination of his head, and took his position. The violin, Miss Marple noticed, was a beautiful instrument, its wood glowing like amber in the lamplight. Mr. Kraus lifted it to his shoulder with the tenderness one might show to something fragile and beloved, and after a moment of absolute stillness, he began to play. The piece was something by Bach, Miss Marple thought, though she could not have named it precisely. What she could recognise, however, and what became immediately apparent to everyone in that room, was that they were in the presence of genuine artistry. The notes seemed to rise and fall with an effortless purity, each phrase shaped with such care and understanding that one forgot entirely about the man holding the instrument and heard only the music itself. It was playing of a quality that one might encounter in a London concert hall or a great cathedral, but which seemed almost shocking in the modest assembly rooms of St. Mary Mead. When the final note faded into silence, there was a breathless pause before the applause began. It was enthusiastic, certainly, but Miss Marple, whose long years of observing her fellow villagers had taught her to notice such things, detected something else beneath the appreciation. In the faces around her, she saw not only admiration, but also a faint discomfort, as though Mr. Kraus's playing had been somehow too fine, too polished, too far beyond what one expected from a gentleman lodging at Mrs. Pritchard's with no visible prospects. Mrs. Fortescue led the applause from her seat in the front row, but her expression, Miss Marple thought, was oddly composed, almost guarded. And as Mr. Kraus bowed once more and left the platform, Miss Marple found herself thinking of something her old friend, long deceased, had once observed about the curious English habit of mistrusting excellence in those who lacked the proper credentials to justify it. Admiration, she reflected, is easy enough to give. Acceptance is something rather different altogether. Chapter 2. A talent too loud for the village. The week following the charity concert brought with it the sort of soft, persistent rain that made the gardens of St. Mary Mead gleam with an almost aggressive greenness, and sent everyone indoors to their sitting rooms, where the business of discussing one's neighbours could be conducted in proper comfort. Miss Marple, who had spent the Monday morning attending to her correspondence and the Tuesday afternoon visiting her nephew Raymond in London, returned to find that Mr. Emil Kraus had become the primary topic of village conversation. This was not, in itself, surprising. Any newcomer to St Mary Mead could expect to be thoroughly discussed, their habits examined, their history speculated upon, and their suitability for village life assessed, with the sort of rigorous attention that would have done credit to a judicial inquiry. What was perhaps more interesting was the particular direction these discussions had taken. Mrs. Price, the doctor's wife, mentioned it first on Wednesday afternoon when Miss Marple encountered her at the lending library. Mrs. Price was a sensible woman in her early 40s, with 3 children and a practical approach to life that Miss Marple had always rather admired. She was not given to idle gossip, which made her observations all the more noteworthy. "Such a pity about Mr. Krauss," she remarked, tucking a volume of essays under her arm. Helen Wentworth had invited him to dinner next Saturday, you know how she collects interesting people, but she's had to withdraw the invitation. Miss Marple, who had been considering whether to take home the new biography of Florence Nightingale or reread one of Trollope's Barsetshire novels, looked up with polite interest. "Oh, I hope Mr. Krauss hasn't taken ill." No, nothing like that." Mrs. Price lowered her voice slightly, though the library was quite empty save for Miss Bunting behind the desk, who was determinedly absorbed in cataloguing. "It's just that Helen's brother is visiting from Edinburgh, and apparently he knows someone who knew someone. Well, you know how these things go. And there was some suggestion that Mr. Krauss's departure from Vienna wasn't entirely, that is to say, there were questions about his associations, political questions." She pronounced the word political with the particular distaste that the English reserve for matters that might disrupt the even tenor of daily life. "I see," said Miss Marple, who in fact saw a great deal more than Mrs. Price perhaps intended. "How very awkward for Mrs. Wentworth." "Yes, isn't it? Of course one can't be too careful these days. And with young people in the house, Helen has her niece staying, you know. Well, one simply cannot risk any sort of unpleasantness." Miss Marple agreed that one could not indeed risk unpleasantness, and selected the Trollope. The following day brought further intelligence. Miss Marple, taking her habitual afternoon walk despite the continuing drizzle, encountered young Dr. Haydock's sister, Griselda, who had married the vicar, and who possessed both a kind heart and an unfortunate tendency to speak before she thought. "Isn't it perfectly dreadful about poor Mr. Krauss?" Griselda burst out, falling into step beside Miss Marple with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her since childhood. "I think it's perfectly beastly the way people are behaving. Leonard invited him to speak to the men's club about music in Vienna, and now old Colonel Bantry has written to say that perhaps it would be better to postpone the talk indefinitely. Indefinitely, which everyone knows means never." "Dear me," said Miss Marple mildly, "that does seem rather a pity. I'm sure Mr. Krauss would have had interesting things to say." "Of course he would, but apparently someone, and I won't say who, though we can all guess, mentioned to the Colonel that Mr. Krauss had never actually specified why he left Austria, and that his references, while perfectly respectable, didn't quite explain what he had been doing for the past few years. And in these times, with all the talk of spies and sympathizers and whatnot, well, the Colonel felt it was his duty to be prudent. She said the word prudent with considerable scorn. "The Colonel is responsible for the men's club," Miss Marple observed. "I suppose he must consider all the members." "Yes, but it's such rot, Miss Marple. Mr. Krauss plays the violin. He's not plotting to overthrow the government from Mrs. Pritchard's back bedroom." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, I don't imagine he is. Still, people do worry, don't they? And sometimes worry makes them unkind without meaning to be." By Friday, the pattern had become unmistakable. Mr. Krauss, who had been briefly and brilliantly visible on the Saturday of the concert, was being quietly erased from the social fabric of St. Mary Mead. Not dramatically, there were no confrontations, no public accusations, nothing so vulgar as an outright snub, but invitations were reconsidered, conversations grew awkward, and the general consensus seemed to be that while Mr. Krauss was doubtless a very talented musician, he was perhaps not quite the sort of person one wanted to know too well. Miss Marple learned the full extent of it on Saturday morning when she attended the meeting of the Women's Institute. Mrs. Angela Fortescue, who served as president and who conducted meetings with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else, made a point of arriving early, and Miss Marple found her in conversation with 2 other committee members near the tea urn. "Quite understand your concern, Dorothy," Mrs. Fortescue was saying to Mrs. Bantry, the Colonel's wife, "and I assure you no one questions your husband's judgment. The men's club must maintain certain standards." Mrs. Bantry, a comfortable woman who bred Pekingese and generally left difficult decisions to her husband, nodded vigorously. "Exactly what I told him. One can't be too careful with foreigners, especially these artistic types. They tend to have such peculiar ideas." Mr. Krauss did play beautifully at the concert, ventured Miss Carmichael, the head mistress of the village school, who was younger than the others and still retained some remnants of idealism. "Oh, no one disputes his talent," Mrs. Fortescue said smoothly. "It's simply a question of suitability. One wants to be charitable, of course, but one also has responsibilities to the community. And there are certain questions about Mr. Krauss's background that remain, shall we say, unanswered." "What sort of questions?" Miss Carmichael asked. Mrs. Fortescue smiled, a pleasant, regretful smile that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and finality. "That, my dear, is precisely the difficulty. One doesn't quite know, but in the absence of certainty, prudence suggests that we should perhaps maintain a certain distance for everyone's protection, you understand." Miss Marple, who had been quietly preparing her tea, looked up. "I wonder," she said gently, "what exactly we are protecting ourselves from?" Mrs. Fortescue turned to her with that particular expression of patient condescension that some people reserve for elderly ladies who ask inconvenient questions. "From uncertainty, Miss Marple, from the possibility of embarrassment, from situations that might reflect poorly on the village. Surely you understand that we have a duty to maintain standards." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "Standards are so very important, though I sometimes think we should be equally careful about the standards we use when judging others, but perhaps that's just an old woman's fancy." She stirred her tea with great concentration, and the conversation moved on to the question of whether the Institute should sponsor a flower arranging competition in June. But later, walking home through the village in the pale spring sunshine that had finally emerged, Miss Marple found herself thinking about Mr. Krauss. She had observed him only briefly at the concert, a quiet, dignified man who had played with the sort of passion that spoke of music being more than mere entertainment or accomplishment. She thought of how his hands had moved on the violin, how his face had transformed during that performance into something both vulnerable and transcendent. And now, barely a week later, he was being systematically excluded from village life. Not for anything he had done, but for being difficult to categorize, for lacking the proper credentials, for making people feel, perhaps, that their own musical accomplishments were rather less impressive than they had previously believed. Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize this particular pattern. She had seen it in the village's treatment of the curate who had married beneath him, in the way they had frozen out the widow who had been a little too cheerful after her husband's death, in their quiet ostracism of anyone who failed to conform to their precise standards of respectability. Admiration, she reflected, was indeed a simple thing to give, but acceptance required something more, something that resembled courage, though most people would never think of it that way. She reached her cottage gate and paused, looking back toward the centre of the village where Mrs. Pritchard's establishment stood. From this distance, she could just make out the attic window where Mr. Krauss presumably had his rooms. No music drifted across the green this afternoon. The village was determinedly, respectably quiet. Chapter 3. Compliments with Conditions. The peculiar thing about praise, Miss Marple had long ago observed, was how easily it could be transformed into something rather less generous simply by the addition of a few carefully chosen words. One need not withdraw the compliment entirely. Indeed, that would be far too obvious. One had merely to qualify it in such a way that the listener understood the praise came with reservations. She noticed this phenomenon operating with particular efficiency in the days following Mr. Krause's gradual exclusion from village society. Those who had applauded his performance at the concert continued to speak well of his playing, but the compliments had acquired a curious texture as though wrapped in tissue paper that muffled their warmth. Miss Marple heard it first from Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the bishop's widow, who had come to tea on Tuesday afternoon bringing with her a pot of quince jelly and an eagerness to discuss the concert. That violinist fellow played quite remarkably, she declared, settling herself into Miss Marple's second-best armchair with the decisive movements of someone accustomed to being listened to. Quite remarkably indeed. Of course one does wonder where all that emotion comes from, doesn't one? Rather too much feeling for Bach, I thought, though I'm no expert. But then, foreigners do tend to express things differently than we do. She said foreigners in the same tone one might use for mushrooms, not actively unpleasant, but requiring careful examination before consumption. I found his playing very moving, Miss Marple said mildly, pouring tea with steady hands, though I confess I know very little about the technical aspects of music. Oh, moving certainly. Rather too moving, perhaps. My late husband always said that excessive emotion in sacred music suggested a certain spiritual instability. Not that Mr. Bach wrote specifically sacred music in this instance, but the principle holds, I think. Miss Marple offered the quince jelly for a scone, and wondered silently what the bishop would have made of his widow's theological extrapolations. The pattern repeated itself throughout the week. At the butcher's shop, Mrs. Clement remarked that Mr. Krause played beautifully for someone with his background. At the post office, Miss Weatherby observed that his technique was quite extraordinary, though one does question the propriety of such intensity in a village setting. Even young Dr. Haydock, who had no particular interest in music, mentioned to Miss Marple that he had heard the performance was impressive in a rather foreign way. Always the qualifier, always the small phrase that transformed admiration into something more ambiguous. Miss Marple encountered the most elaborate example of this linguistic artistry on Thursday morning, when she attended the monthly meeting of the Flower Guild at the vicarage. The meeting itself was routine. There were chrysanthemums to be ordered for autumn, a dispute about whether Mrs. Bantry had monopolised the altar arrangements for too many consecutive Sundays, and the perennial question of what to do about Miss Hartnell's enthusiasm for gladioli, which everyone found vulgar but no one wished to say directly. But during the tea interval, as the ladies gathered around Griselda's drawing room with their cups and biscuits, the conversation turned inevitably to Mr. Sir Krause. "I do think it's rather sad," said Miss Carmichael, the schoolmistress, who had evidently been thinking about the matter. "He played so beautifully, and now it seems as though the whole village has turned against him." "Turned against him," Mrs. Fortescue repeated, with just the right note of surprise in her voice. "My dear Miss Carmichael, no one has turned against Mr. Krause. We simply feel, those of us who have lived here rather longer, that we must be circumspect about whom we encourage. Surely you understand the difference? But he hasn't done anything wrong," Miss Carmichael persisted, with the stubbornness of someone who had not yet learned when to abandon a position. Mrs. Fortescue smiled, a smile of infinite patience encountering limited understanding. "That we know of, certainly. But there is rather a lot we don't know, isn't there? And in the absence of certainty, one must protect one's position, one's family, one's good name." "I thought his playing was magnificent," said Mrs. Price, who rarely involved herself in village politics, but who seemed moved to speak on this occasion. "My daughter is learning the violin, and I had hoped she might take a lesson or two from Mr. Krause. Surely there's no harm in that." "Lessons?" Mrs. Fortescue's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Well, naturally, that's your decision entirely, my dear, though I do think one must consider what message it sends, allowing one's daughter to spend time alone with a gentleman about whom we know so very little, particularly such a sensitive girl as your Alice." There was a small charged silence. Mrs. Price's daughter was indeed a sensitive child given to nerves and nightmares, and the suggestion, delicately made, never quite stated, was perfectly clear. "I hadn't thought of it that way," Mrs. Price said slowly, and Miss Marple saw the moment when possibility died. Griselda, who had been growing increasingly red in the face, set down her teacup with more force than was strictly necessary. "I think that's perfectly horrid," she announced. "You're all being perfectly horrid about a man who has done nothing but play the violin beautifully, and I think we should all be ashamed of ourselves." "My dear Mrs. Clement," Mrs. Fortescue said, her voice acquiring a slight edge, "no one is being horrid. We are simply being realistic. And those of us with experience in these matters understand that kindness must sometimes be tempered with judgment. We cannot allow our sympathies to override our common sense." "But what exactly are we being sensible about?" Griselda demanded. "What has he actually done?" Mrs. Fortescue rose, gathering her gloves with the air of someone who has explained something perfectly obvious and cannot be expected to repeat herself indefinitely. "It isn't always what one has done," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's simply a question of what one is, and Mr. Krauss, talented though he may be, is not quite our sort. Surely even you can see that." She departed shortly thereafter, and the meeting dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs. Miss Marple, who had said very little throughout the exchange, found herself walking home beside Miss Carmichael, who was clearly distressed. "Is it wrong of me to think they're being unfair?" the young woman asked. "Mrs. Fortescue makes it all sound so reasonable, but it feels cruel." "I don't think you're wrong," Miss Marple said gently, "though I suspect Mrs. Fortescue genuinely believes she's acting in everyone's best interest. That's often how these things work, you know. People convince themselves that exclusion is protection and judgment is prudence. It makes it much easier to sleep at night." "But it's still wrong." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It is still wrong, though I'm afraid that doesn't make it any less common." They had reached the corner where their paths diverged. Miss Carmichael hesitated, then said, "You know, I thought I heard him playing yesterday evening, very quietly, as though he didn't want anyone to hear. It was the saddest sound I've ever heard." Miss Marple thought about that as she continued home. Music played quietly, apologetically, by someone who had learned that their gift was unwelcome. Talent that had become somehow an embarrassment rather than a treasure. She remembered something her mother had said many years ago, about how the worst cruelties were often committed by people who believed themselves to be doing the right thing, and how praise, when offered with conditions attached, was sometimes more painful than no praise at all. The afternoon sun slanted across the village green, warm and innocent. Everything looked perfectly peaceful, perfectly respectable, perfectly kind. But Miss Marple, who had learned long ago to look beneath surfaces, wondered how much of that peace was genuine, and how much was simply the silence of someone who had learned not to make themselves heard. Chapter 4. A Silence After Applause. Miss Marple had always been sensitive to the rhythms of village life. She knew, for instance, that Mrs. McGillicuddy's chickens began their morning chorus at 5:20, that the postman whistled the British Grenadiers only on Thursdays, and that Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, invariably walked his spaniel at 7:30 in the evening, rain or shine. These small regularities formed the warp and weft of daily existence, and any disruption to them was as noticeable as a misstitch in knitting. Which was why she noticed, on the Monday of the third week in May, that Mr. Krauss had stopped playing his violin at the usual hours. For the past 2 months, ever since his arrival in St. Mary Mead, the sound of violin practice had drifted across the village green most evenings between 6 and 7 o'clock. It had become part of the landscape, as familiar as the church bells or the rooks cawing in the elm trees. Miss Marple, whose cottage faced toward Mrs. Pritchard's establishment, had grown accustomed to hearing scales and arpeggios, fragments of Mozart and Brahms, the same difficult passages repeated with patient determination until they emerged smooth and finished. But for 3 days now there had been nothing. At first, she thought perhaps Mr. Krause had gone away. People did leave the village occasionally after all for business or family obligations, but on Tuesday morning she caught sight of him walking down the high street with that careful, upright bearing she had noticed before, carrying his violin case but looking somehow diminished, as though he had learned to take up less space in the world. She mentioned the silence to her nephew Raymond when he telephoned that evening. "Perhaps he's simply taking a rest," Raymond suggested, with the easy optimism of someone who lived in London and had never had to navigate the complexities of village disapproval. "Musicians do need breaks, don't they?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, though she did not think it was that simple. The confirmation came on Wednesday afternoon, when she encountered Mrs. Pritchard at the draper's shop. Mrs. Pritchard was examining a bolt of serviceable grey flannel with the concentration of someone who found such decisions genuinely taxing, and she seemed relieved to have an excuse to set it aside. "Miss Marple, how pleasant to see you. I was just trying to decide whether this would do for new curtains in the back bedroom, but I confess I find myself quite unable to choose. Do you think it would be too sombre?" "I think it would be very sensible," Miss Marple said, "though if you want to add a touch of brightness, perhaps a lighter fabric for the tie-backs." They discussed curtains for a few minutes with the seriousness such matters deserved, and then Miss Marple said, as casually as she could manage, "I hope Mr. Krause is quite well. I haven't heard his evening practice lately." Mrs. Pritchard's face, which had been open and pleasant, became guarded. "Oh, he's well enough in body, I suppose, but he's become very quiet, Miss Marple, very quiet indeed. Hardly comes down for meals any more, asks me to leave his tray outside the door. And as for the violin, well, I think he still plays, but only very late at night, and so softly one can barely hear it. It's quite changed from how he was when he first arrived." "I see," Miss Marple said. "That must be rather worrying for you." Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice, though the shop was empty save for the draper's assistant, who was absorbed in measuring ribbon at the far counter. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I think he's been hurt by the way people have treated him. He doesn't say anything, mind you. He's far too much of a gentleman for that. But I can tell. The invitations that got cancelled, the way people have stopped speaking to him after church. He notices these things." "I'm sure he does," Miss Marple said quietly, "and I feel badly about it, truly I do. He's been a model lodger, never a moment's trouble, always courteous and considerate. But what can I do?" Mrs. Fortescue stopped by last week, very kindly of course, just being neighbourly, and mentioned that she'd heard I was letting rooms to a foreign gentleman, and did I think it was quite wise given the uncertainties of the times. She didn't say I shouldn't, of course, but the implication was clear enough. "That must have been difficult for you." Mrs. Pritchard nodded miserably. "I told her that Mr. Krause had given me no cause for concern, and she said that was exactly her point, that one never knows, does one, until it's too late, and that it would be dreadful if my good name suffered because I'd been too trusting. I haven't asked him to leave, Miss Marple, I want you to know that, but I confess I've been less welcoming than I was at first, and I think he's felt it." Miss Marple touched Mrs. Pritchard's arm gently. "You're in a difficult position. No one could blame you for trying to protect yourself." "But it feels wrong all the same," Mrs. Pritchard said, and there was genuine distress in her voice. "He's done nothing to deserve this treatment. Nothing at all." That evening Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room as the spring twilight deepened into dusk. She had positioned her chair near the window, ostensibly to catch the last of the light for her knitting, but in truth because it offered a clear view across to Mrs. Pritchard's. At 9:30, when the village had grown quiet and respectable people were beginning to think of bed, she heard it, so faint she might have missed it had she not been listening. The sound of a violin played with heartbreaking delicacy, as though the musician were afraid of being overheard. It was not practice this time, not the methodical repetition of difficult passages. It was simply music, tentative and sad, the sort of playing one might do for oneself alone when the world had proven too harsh for public performance. The melody was one Miss Marple did not recognise, though it had the quality of a folk song, simple and mournful. It spoke of loss and longing, of places left behind and welcomes that never came, and it was played so softly, so apologetically, that it broke her heart a little to hear it. After perhaps 10 minutes, the music stopped. A light went on in the attic window, then extinguished shortly after. The village returned to its customary silence. Miss Marple set down her knitting and sat very still in the gathering darkness. She thought about talent that had been judged excessive, about gifts that had made their possessor unwelcome, about the peculiar cruelty of a community that could drive someone to practice their art in whispers as though it was something shameful. She had seen this pattern before, in different forms and circumstances. A village, like any society, had its own equilibrium, and anything that disturbed that balance, anything too excellent, too foreign, too difficult to categorize, would be gradually pushed to the margins until it either conformed or disappeared entirely. It was not done with malice, necessarily. Most people who participate in such exclusions believe themselves to be acting reasonably, protecting what was theirs, maintaining proper standards, but the result was the same whether the motive was cruelty or merely caution. Miss Marple rose and drew her curtains against the night. Tomorrow she would make a point of walking past Mrs. Pritchard's establishment. Perhaps she might even find an excuse to call. It would accomplish nothing, she knew. One elderly spinster could not stand against the combined force of village opinion. But she could at least bear witness, she could notice. And sometimes, she reflected, that was all one could do, though she had learned over her many years that noticing was often more powerful than people supposed. Small observations, carefully collected, had a way of revealing truths that louder voices preferred to ignore. Outside, the night was clear and still. No music disturbed the village peace. St. Mary Mead slept, comfortable in its righteousness, convinced of its own benevolence. And in an attic room on Orchard Lane, a violin lay silent in its case, put away for the night like something that had learned its place. Chapter 5, What People Chose Not to Hear. There are certain words, Miss Marple had long ago observed, that need never be spoken aloud in order to do their work. One had merely to let them hang in the air, unfinished and suggestive, and allow other people's imaginations to complete the sentence. It was a peculiarly effective form of destruction, requiring neither evidence nor commitment, and it had the advantage of leaving the speaker blameless. After all, one could hardly be accused of slander if one had never actually made an accusation. The rumour, for that was what it was, though it never quite crystallized into anything so definite as a specific claim, began sometime during the last week of May. Miss Marple could not pinpoint its exact origin, which was itself revealing. The most damaging gossip rarely had a traceable source. It simply appeared, like fog rolling in from the sea, until everyone was speaking of something that no one could quite define. She first became aware of it on Thursday afternoon, when she stopped at the grocer's to collect her weekly order. Mrs. Yates, the grocer's wife, was serving behind the counter, and her manner had that particular quality of suppressed excitement that suggested interesting news. "Such a pity about young Susan Price," Mrs. Yates remarked, weighing out sugar with unnecessary care. "Her mother has decided against the violin lessons after all, though I suppose one can't blame her given the circumstances." Miss Marple, who had been examining a display of tinned peaches, looked up with polite inquiry. "Oh? I hadn't heard that Susan was unwell." "Unwell? Oh, no, nothing like that. No, it's just that Mrs. Price felt it wouldn't be appropriate. Not after what came to light." "I see," said Miss Marple, though in fact she saw nothing at all. How disappointing for Susan. She was so eager to learn. Mrs. Yates leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to that confidential pitch that invited shared understanding. "Well, one must put a child's welfare first, mustn't one? And when there are questions about a gentleman's character, particularly regarding young girls, well, one simply cannot be too careful." She said this with an air of profound wisdom, as though imparting a truth both obvious and weighty. "Has something happened?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, I wouldn't like to say anything definite," Mrs. Yates replied, which was precisely the phrasing that allowed one to say anything at all. But apparently there was an incident. Nothing proven, you understand, but enough to make a mother think twice. That's all I know, and I wouldn't repeat it to anyone but you, Miss Marple, knowing how discreet you are." Miss Marple accepted this confidence with appropriate gravity and left the shop with her groceries and a growing sense of unease. By Friday, the rumour had acquired additional layers, like pearl forming around sand. At the lending library, Miss Bunting mentioned that she'd heard Mr. Krause had been asked to leave a previous teaching position under a cloud. At the post office, Mrs. Prothero observed that it was fortunate the matter had come to light before any real harm was done. And at the chemist's, young Mr. Edmonds, who had no children and no particular interest in music, nevertheless felt compelled to remark that one couldn't be too careful with artistic types who tended to have irregular morals. What no one could specify, what indeed no one seemed to have actually witnessed, was what Mr. Krause had supposedly done. The accusation, if it could even be called that, existed in a realm of careful implication and significant pauses. Something about a remark overheard. A misunderstanding, perhaps, or perhaps not. Nothing one could quite put one's finger on, but enough to make a responsible parent cautious. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime translating the coded language of village discourse, understood perfectly well what was happening, and accusation of impropriety with a child was among the most destructive things that could be suggested about a man, precisely because it required no proof and permitted no defence. To deny it too vehemently would seem suspicious, to ignore it would appear guilty, and the very act of discussing one's innocence would spread the rumour further, ensuring that even those who believed in one's good character would forever associate one's name with the whispered suggestion. It was, in its way, a perfect weapon. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple made a point of walking past the Price residence, a neat brick house with a well-tended garden where Susan could often be seen playing. Today, however, the girl was nowhere to be visible, and when Miss Marple happened to encounter Mrs. Price coming out of the greengrocer's, the woman's greeting was friendly but hurried, with none of the usual willingness to pause for conversation. "I do hope Susan is well," Miss Marple ventured. "Oh yes, quite well. Thank you," Mrs. Price said, already moving past. "Do forgive me, Miss Marple, but I really must dash. So much to do today." She disappeared down the high street with the air of someone fleeing an awkward encounter, and Miss Marple was left with the distinct impression that Mrs. Price would prefer not to discuss her daughter's abandoned music lessons. The true confirmation of what had occurred came that afternoon, when Griselda Clement appeared at Miss Marple's door in a state of considerable agitation. "It's absolutely monstrous," she announced, sweeping into the sitting room without waiting for an invitation. "Have you heard what they're saying about Mr. Krause? That he made some sort of inappropriate advance towards Susan Price? It's complete nonsense, Miss Marple, complete and utter nonsense." "Do sit down, dear," Miss Marple said mildly, "and tell me what you've learned." Griselda flung herself into a chair with more force than elegance. "I've just come from speaking with Mrs. Price. I thought she should know what people are saying in case she wanted to contradict it, but do you know what she told me? That there never was any inappropriate behaviour. None at all. What happened was that Susan mentioned to a friend, who mentioned it to her mother, who mentioned it to someone else, that Mr. Krause had once complimented her playing and said she had sensitive hands. That's all. Sensitive hands. And somehow that got twisted and repeated and adjusted until it sounded like something sinister." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And did Mrs. Price correct the misunderstanding?" Griselda's expression grew troubled. "That's just it. She won't. She says it's better to let the matter drop quietly. That drawing attention to it would only make things worse. Mrs. Fortescue advised her that discretion was the wisest course, and that it was better to err on the side of caution where children were concerned." "Mrs. Fortescue advised her." Yes, apparently Mrs. Fortescue heard about the comment, the innocent comment, and suggested to Mrs. Price that while she was certain there was no real danger, it might be best not to allow Susan to spend time alone with a gentleman whose background was unclear. For the child's protection, you understand, and Mrs. Price, being a sensible woman who values her reputation, decided that Mrs. Fortescue was right. "And what does Mrs. Price intend to do about the rumour?" "Nothing. Griselda said flatly. She says it would be impossible to contradict without seeming to defend Mr. Kraus, which would make her look foolish. Better to simply let it fade away naturally. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, considering the elegant cruelty of what had been accomplished. A casual remark, repeated with slight embellishment, had been transformed into something toxic. No one had lied outright. No one could be accused of deliberate malice. Mrs. Fortescue had merely suggested caution. Mrs. Price had merely acted prudently. The friend's mother had merely expressed concern. Each step had been individually defensible. And yet the result was that Mr. Kraus now stood accused of something he had never done, by people who would never confront him, based on evidence that did not exist. "What will you do?" Griselda asked. Miss Marple looked at her hands, folded quietly in her lap. "I'm not sure there's anything to be done," she said. "One can hardly fight a rumour that refuses to take definite shape. It's like trying to grasp smoke. But it's destroying him. You've seen how he's withdrawn, and now this vile suggestion that he's unsafe around children. It's wicked, Miss Marple. Absolutely wicked." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Though I suspect most of those spreading it would be genuinely shocked to hear you say so. They think they're being protective, responsible, doing what any decent person would do." She rose and moved to the window, looking out across the village green toward Orchard Lane. "The problem, you see, is that respectability and cruelty are not opposites. Sometimes they're companions." Chapter 6. The Weight of a Good Name. Miss Marple had always believed that if one wished to understand a situation properly, one should go directly to its source. This was why, on Monday morning, she found herself walking purposefully toward Elm Grove, the substantial Victorian residence where Mrs. Angela Fortescue lived, in solitary comfort since her husband's death some 7 years previously. It was not an impromptu visit. Miss Marple had telephoned the previous evening to ask whether she might call, ostensibly to discuss a small matter regarding the parish flower fund. Mrs. Fortescue, who served on every committee of consequence in St. Mary Mead, and who therefore could not easily refuse such a request, had agreed to receive her at 11 o'clock. The house stood at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by rhododendrons that were just coming into bloom. It was the sort of residence that announced its owner's position without vulgarity, large enough to require servants, but not so large as to suggest ostentation. The drawing room into which Miss Marple was shown reflected the same careful balance, well appointed without being showy, tasteful without being cold. Mrs. Fortescue herself appeared punctually at 11, dressed in a morning frock of dove-grey wool that managed to suggest both mourning and elegance. She greeted Miss Marple with the cordial warmth of someone who has learned to be gracious to all levels of society, and rang for coffee with the easy authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "How pleasant to see you, Miss Marple," she said, settling herself into a wing chair with the posture of someone who had attended an expensive finishing school. "Now, what was it you wished to discuss about the flower fund? I must confess, I thought we'd settled all the arrangements at last week's meeting." "Oh, we had indeed," Miss Marple said, accepting her coffee cup with a slight tremor in her hands that was not entirely feigned. "The flower fund was simply an excuse, I'm afraid. What I really wished to discuss was Mr. Kraus." Mrs. Fortescue's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted behind her eyes, a wariness perhaps, or a calculation of how to respond. "Mr. Kraus, the violinist. I'm not sure what there is to discuss, though I suppose you've heard the unfortunate talk that's been circulating?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "I've heard it. And I've also heard that much of it is based on a misunderstanding, a quite innocent remark that has been rather badly distorted." Mrs. Fortescue sipped her coffee before responding, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm not sure I would characterize it as a misunderstanding, Miss Marple. When a gentleman makes comments about a young girl's physical attributes, however he phrases them, it raises questions. Surely you can see that." "He complimented her hands in the context of her violin playing," Miss Marple said. "Hardly an improper observation for a music teacher to make." "Perhaps," Mrs. Fortescue set down her cup with a soft click against the saucer. But context matters less than perception, I'm afraid. And the perception, fairly or not, is that Mr. Krause's attentions toward the child were inappropriate. Better to act on that perception than to risk discovering too late that one's caution was justified. Even if acting on that perception destroys an innocent man's reputation. Mrs. Fortescue regarded Miss Marple with an expression that mingled patience with faint condescension, like a teacher addressing a well-meaning but naive pupil. Miss Marple, I respect your compassion. Truly I do. But you must understand that I have responsibilities to this community. My late husband left me in a position of some influence, and with that influence comes an obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Young Susan Price is 12 years old. She is vulnerable in ways that Mr. Krause, a grown man with experience of the world, is not. But if there was no actual impropriety— Can you be certain of that? Mrs. Fortescue interrupted gently. Can you guarantee with absolute confidence that Mr. Krause harbours no inappropriate interests, that he has never in all his years of teaching crossed a boundary that should not be crossed? Can anyone guarantee such things about anyone? Miss Marple replied. We must make judgments based on evidence, surely, not on the mere possibility of wrongdoing. Mrs. Fortescue rose and moved to the window, looking out over her immaculate gardens with the air of someone marshalling her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Evidence is a luxury we cannot always afford when children are concerned. By the time evidence becomes apparent, damage may already have been done, and I cannot allow that to happen in a community for which I bear responsibility. If that means erring on the side of caution, then so be it. And Mr. Krause, what of his good name? Mr. Krause, Mrs. Fortescue said, turning back to face Miss Marple, is a stranger to this village. He has no family here, no history, no ties that would give us confidence in his character. He arrived with no references beyond a few letters from people we've never heard of. He lodges in rooms rather than maintaining his own establishment, and his background, foreign, artistic, solitary, makes him by definition suspect. Suspect of what, precisely? Mrs. Fortescue's expression grew almost pitying. My dear Miss Marple, you've lived in St. Mary Mead all your life, surrounded by people whose families you've known for generations. You have the luxury of trust because you have the security of familiarity. But those of us who must make decisions about the community's welfare cannot afford to trust so easily. We must protect the good names of those who belong here, even if that means being less welcoming to those who do not. She returned to her chair, her movements carrying the finality of someone who's explained something perfectly obvious. I suggested to Mrs. Price that she reconsider the violin lessons. I did so not out of malice toward Mr. Krause, but out of concern for Susan's welfare. If my caution has been misinterpreted by others as evidence of wrongdoing on Mr. Krause's part, well, that is regrettable but hardly my responsibility. I cannot control what conclusions people draw from my actions. But you must have known what conclusions they would draw, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Fortescue met her gaze steadily. I knew that people would understand I was acting in the child's best interests. Yes. And if Mr. Krause is entirely innocent, if he has done nothing beyond playing the violin beautifully and making the occasional kind remark to a student, then he will recover from this small embarrassment, Mrs. Fortescue said with perfect calm. Men are resilient creatures, Miss Marple, particularly men of the world like Mr. Krause. A few weeks of cooled relations in a village he barely knows will hardly destroy him, whereas a child's innocence, once compromised, can never be restored. Surely you see which risk I prefer to take. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman before her. Mrs. Fortescue's face showed nothing but serene confidence in the rightness of her position. She believed quite genuinely that she had acted correctly. She had weighed the competing interests, a stranger's reputation against a child's safety, and had chosen what seemed to her the only reasonable course. That her choice had been made easier by the fact that Mr. Krause was foreign, poor, and socially inconvenient was something she would likely never acknowledge, even to herself. She had wrapped her prejudice in the respectable garment of maternal concern, and the fit was so perfect that she could not feel the roughness of the fabric beneath. "I understand your position, Miss Marple," said finally, rising to take her leave. "Thank you for explaining it so clearly." "I hope I haven't disappointed you," Mrs. Fortescue said, walking her to the door. "I know you have a kind heart, Miss Marple, and I suspect you see this as a matter of simple charity. But those of us with greater responsibilities must sometimes make harder choices. It's a burden of leadership, I'm afraid." Miss Marple paused at the threshold, turning back with the mildest of expressions. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether it's more of a burden to make such choices, or to live with having made them. Good morning, Mrs. Fortescue." She walked home slowly, through streets that looked peaceful and prosperous in the spring sunshine. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, perfectly respectable, perfectly kind. But Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the worst cruelties often wore the most convincing disguises, found herself thinking that there was nothing quite so dangerous as someone who believed absolutely in their own righteousness. Chapter 7. An evening practice unattended. The first day of June arrived with that particular quality of English early summer that seems almost too perfect to be real. Cloudless sky, a gentle warmth, and gardens so abundantly in bloom that one might be forgiven for thinking nature had decided to show off. It was the sort of day when the village looked its absolute best, when every cottage seemed charming and every hedgerow picturesque, and when it became difficult to imagine that anything unpleasant could occur in such a setting. Miss Marple spent the morning tending to her roses, which had responded to the recent weather with gratifying enthusiasm. She was just considering whether to cut a few for the sitting room when she heard it, faint and hesitant, but unmistakable. The sound of a violin drifting across the village green from the direction of Mrs. Pritchard's establishment. She straightened, secateurs in hand, and listened. It was the first time in nearly a week that she had heard Mr. Krause play during daylight hours. The music was uncertain, stopping and starting as though the player were testing whether the instrument still remembered how to sing. The melody was nothing she recognized, perhaps an improvisation, or something from his childhood. It carried in the still air with a quality that struck her as almost painfully tentative, like someone speaking after a long enforced silence. After perhaps 10 minutes, the music stopped. Miss Marple waited, but it did not resume. She returned to her roses with a thoughtful expression, wondering whether this brief recital signified hope or merely a final attempt at defiance. The answer came that evening. Miss Marple had just finished her light supper, a poached egg, and some asparagus from her own garden, when she heard voices outside. Not the usual cheerful exchanges of neighbours meeting on the street, but something sharper, more urgent. She moved to her window and saw Mrs. Pritchard standing in her doorway, speaking to Dr. Haydock with considerable agitation. Even from this distance, Miss Marple could see that Mrs. Pritchard was wringing her hands, that universal gesture of distress that transcends all barriers of class and circumstance. Miss Marple did not hesitate. She collected her shawl and made her way across the green with more speed than her age might typically permit. By the time she arrived, a small group had gathered: Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Pritchard, the vicar, and young Constable Polk, who had been fetched from his cottage at the edge of the village. Mrs. Pritchard was weeping openly now, her face blotched and her voice catching on every other word. "I should have looked in on him earlier," she was saying. "I should have known something was wrong when he asked for his supper tray to be left outside the door again. But he'd been doing that for days, you see, and I thought he simply preferred his privacy." Dr. Haydock, a sensible man in his 50s who had seen both the best and worst of village life, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You couldn't have known, Mrs. Pritchard. No one could have predicted this." "Is someone ill?" Miss Marple asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. The vicar turned to her, his usually cheerful face drawn with concern. "It's Mr. Krause, Miss Marple. Mrs. Pritchard found him in his room. I'm afraid he's dead." The words seemed to fall into a pocket of silence. Around them the evening continued in its usual way. Birds sang, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. The scent of honeysuckle drifted on the air, but something fundamental had shifted, as though the village had tipped slightly on its axis. "May I ask what happened?" Miss Marple said. Dr. Haydock glanced at Mrs. Pritchard, then answered with the careful neutrality of a medical man reporting facts. "It appears to have been heart failure. I've just examined him. He was seated in his chair with his violin across his knees, as though he'd been playing. There's no sign of violence or struggle. These things do happen, particularly in cases of prolonged stress." "Stress," Miss Marple repeated softly. "The heart is a complex organ," de Haydock continued. "Emotional strain can be just as damaging as physical exertion, sometimes more so." Mrs. Pritchard gave a small broken sob. "I brought his supper tray up an hour ago and knocked, but there was no answer. I thought perhaps he'd fallen asleep or gone out, though I hadn't heard him leave. But then I remembered that he had asked for matches this morning, said his fire had gone out, and I thought I should bring them up in case he needed them, so I knocked again, and when there was still no answer, I used my key." She pressed a handkerchief to her face, her voice muffled. "He looked so peaceful, Miss Marple, as though he'd simply drifted off while playing. But his hands were cold when I touched them, and I knew." The vicar murmured something, consoling, and Constable Polk shifted his weight uncomfortably, his notebook in hand, though there seemed little reason to make notes. Miss Marple stood very still, taking in the scene. The small group gathered in the twilight, the open door of Mrs. Pritchard's establishment, the windows of the attic room where a light now burned, lit presumably, when the doctor arrived. Everything looked ordinary, explicable, sad, but not suspicious. And yet, had Mr. Krause complained of any illness? She asked. Chest pains, difficulty breathing, anything of that nature? Dr. Haydock shook his head. "Not to my knowledge, though he hadn't consulted me professionally. Some people prefer to suffer in silence." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "some people do." She thought of the music she had heard that afternoon. Tentative, uncertain, but still music. A man did not play the violin if he knew his heart was about to fail. Or perhaps he did, if music was all he had left. "The violin," she said suddenly. "Was it damaged in any way?" The question seemed to surprise everyone. Dr. Haydock frowned slightly. "The violin? No. It appeared perfectly intact." "Why do you ask?" "I just wondered," Miss Marple said vaguely. "One hears of instruments being damaged when their owners fall ill, but I suppose if he simply dozed off, the death would have been quite peaceful," Dr. Haydock assured her. "Quick, most likely. He may not have realised anything was wrong." They stood in silence for a moment, and then the vicar cleared his throat. "I suppose there will need to be arrangements made. Did Mr. Krause have any family? Anyone who should be notified?" Mrs. Pritchard shook her head. "He never mentioned anyone. All his letters came from professional contacts in London, concert halls and the like. I don't think there was any family. He seemed quite alone in the world." "Then the parish will see to it," the vicar said firmly. "It's the least we can do." Miss Marple looked up at the lighted window of the attic room, where Emil Krause had lived his quiet, unwelcome life for the past 3 months, where he had played his violin with such passion, and then with such apologetic softness, and finally not at all except in whispers, where he had been judged and found wanting by people who had never bothered to know him, and where he had died, alone, with only his music for company. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is the very least we can do." Chapter 8. The Difference Between Blame and Cause. The funeral took place on Thursday afternoon, a grey day that seemed fitting for such a melancholy occasion. St. Mary Mead's cemetery lay at the eastern edge of the village, where the land sloped gently toward the river, and ancient yew trees cast shadows across weathered headstones. The service was brief and dignified, conducted by the vicar with appropriate solemnity, though there was something perfunctory about it, as though the rituals were being observed more from duty than from genuine grief. Miss Marple attended, as did perhaps 24 others, a respectable showing for a man who had lived in the village for barely 3 months and who had made so few connections. Mrs. Pritchard wept quietly into her handkerchief. Dr. Haydock stood with his wife near the back. The vicar's wife, Griselda, looked pale and angry, her lips pressed into a thin line, and Mrs. Fortescue, dressed in sombre navy, maintained an expression of dignified sorrow that revealed nothing of her thoughts. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully was the absence. Susan Price and her mother were not in attendance, nor was Mrs. Price's husband, a quiet man who worked as a surveyor and who generally deferred to his wife in matters of social judgment. Their absence spoke volumes, though what exactly it said depended on how one chose to interpret it. After the brief committal, the mourners dispersed with the usual murmured condolences and arrangements about tea at the vicarage for those who wished to attend. Miss Marple accepted, knowing that such gatherings often revealed more than the ceremonies themselves. The vicarage drawing-room was arranged with sandwiches and cake, tea poured from the second-best service. The conversation was subdued, circling carefully around the central facts of Mr. Krause's death, without quite addressing them directly. People spoke of heart failure in those over 50, of the importance of regular medical examinations, of the sad fate of those who had no family to care for them in their declining years. Miss Marple sipped her tea and listened, noting who spoke and who remained silent, who met each other's eyes and who looked away. Mrs. Fortescue, she observed, conversed easily with the doctor's wife about the upcoming garden fete, showing no sign of discomfort or second thought. Why should she? A man had died of natural causes. Tragic, certainly, but hardly anyone's fault. It was only when Griselda approached, her face still set in those lines of suppressed anger, that the careful surface was disturbed. "I hope you're satisfied," she said quietly to Mrs. Fortescue, her voice low enough not to carry but sharp enough to cut. "Your caution has protected us all most thoroughly." Mrs. Fortescue's expression remained composed. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Clement. Mr. Krause died of heart failure. A tragedy, but hardly something for which anyone bears responsibility." "Didn't they?" Griselda's voice shook slightly. "I suppose the stress of being ostracized, accused of things he never did, driven into isolation, I suppose none of that contributed to the failure of his heart." "My dear young woman," Mrs. Fortescue said with the patience of someone addressing an overwrought child, "you cannot possibly suggest that ordinary social reserve caused Mr. Krause's death. The doctor has certified natural causes." "Natural causes," Griselda repeated bitterly. "Yes, I suppose they are natural when you make someone's life unbearable." She turned and walked away before Mrs. Fortescue could respond, leaving a small ripple of uncomfortable silence in her wake. Several people found sudden reasons to examine their teacups or remark on the weather. Miss Marple waited until the gathering had thinned before making her way home. She had learned what she needed to know, which was primarily that the village had already decided how to remember Mr. Krause as a sad case of a solitary man who had died alone, a cautionary tale about the importance of community and family ties. The fact that the village itself had ensured his solitude would not, she suspected, feature prominently in this narrative. The following morning, Miss Marple did something she had been considering since Mr. Krause's death. She called upon Mrs. Price. The Price residence was quiet when she arrived, the curtains drawn against the morning sun. Mrs. Price answered the door herself, looking surprised and perhaps slightly wary at finding Miss Marple on her doorstep. "Miss Marple, how unexpected. Do come in, won't you?" The sitting room was neat and pleasant, furnished in the modern style that had become popular after the war. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece. Susan as a baby, Susan starting school, Susan with her violin at her first recital. A life carefully documented, carefully protected. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple began, settling herself in the offered chair. "But I wanted to speak with you about Mr. Krause." Mrs. Price's face closed slightly. "I heard about his death, of course, very sad of us, but I'm not sure what you expect me to say about it." "I expect you to tell me the truth," Miss Marple said gently, "about what really happened with Susan and Mr. Krause. Not the version that spread through the village, but what actually occurred." For a long moment, Mrs. Price said nothing. Then quite suddenly, her composure crumpled. She pressed her hands to her face, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with tears. There was nothing at all. Susan mentioned, it was such a small thing, that Mr. Krause had complimented her hands, said she had sensitive fingers that would serve her well as she developed her technique. That was all. Just a teacher's observation about a student's potential. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. And how did this observation become something more sinister? Mrs. Price lowered her hands, her eyes red. Susan told her friend Mary the way girls do, proud of the compliment, and Mary mentioned it to her mother, Mrs. Hartley, quite innocently, but Mrs. Hartley... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Hartley has always been rather protective, suspicious even. She repeated it to someone else, wondering aloud whether it was appropriate for a man to comment on a young girl's hands. And somehow in the retelling the context was lost. By the time Mrs. Fortescue heard about it, it had become something questionable. And Mrs. Fortescue came to you. Yes, Mrs. Price's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She was very kind about it, very understanding. She said she was certain there was nothing improper in Mr. Krause's intentions, but that in these uncertain times, with a man whose background we didn't fully know, it might be wiser to exercise caution. For Susan's sake, she suggested that I reconsider the violin lessons. Which you did. What else could I do? Mrs. Price's voice rose slightly, defensive now. Mrs. Fortescue made it clear, without saying so directly, you understand, that if I continued to allow Susan to spend time with Mr. Krause, people would question my judgment as a mother. They would wonder why I was willing to take risks with my daughter's safety. And in a village like this, Miss Marple, reputation matters, particularly for a young girl. So you cancelled the lessons? Yes, and I told Susan not to speak of it further. I thought that would be the end of it. She twisted her handkerchief in her hands. But then the whispers started. People asking me if Susan was all right, if anything had happened, if I'd noticed anything concerning about Mr. Krause. And when I tried to explain that there had been no misconduct, that it was simply a precaution, they nodded and smiled and clearly didn't believe me. Because contradiction, in such cases, is often interpreted as defence, Miss Marple observed. Exactly. Mrs. Fortescue herself advised me that it would be better to let the matter rest quietly, that drawing attention to it would only make things worse, might even suggest we had something to hide. She said the kindest thing I could do for both Susan and Mr. Krause was simply to maintain a dignified silence and allow the talk to die down naturally. And did it? Mrs. Price's silence was answer enough. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she said finally, her voice breaking. I was only trying to protect my daughter. And now a man is dead, and I can't help feeling... She couldn't finish the sentence. Miss Marple reached across and touched her hand gently. Can't help feeling responsible, even though you committed no deliberate cruelty, told no actual lies. Yes, Mrs. Price whispered. That's exactly it. I keep thinking, if I had just stood firm, if I had publicly corrected the misunderstanding, if I had allowed Susan to continue her lesson, would he still be alive? Perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly. Perhaps not. The heart is a complex thing, as Dr. Haydock said. We cannot know what other burdens Mr. Krause carried, what other sorrows he had endured, but what we can know is that he was driven into isolation by people who convinced themselves they were acting wisely. And you, my dear, were one of those people, however good your intentions. Mrs. Price wept openly now, and Miss Marple let her, knowing that sometimes tears were the only adequate response to truth. What should I do? Mrs. Price asked finally. Is there anything I can do? You can remember, Miss Marple said. You can remember what happened here and why, and what the cost was. And perhaps, when the next stranger arrives in St. Mary Mead, you can choose differently. She rose to leave, pausing at the door. There's a difference, you know, between blame and cause. You are not to blame for Mr. Krause's death. Dr. Haydock certified natural causes, and I believe him, but you were But part of the cause, part of the pattern of exclusion and suspicion that made his life unbearable, understanding that difference may be the most important thing you ever learn. She walked home slowly, feeling her age more than usual. The truth was now clear, laid out in all its painful ordinariness. No villain, no crime, no dramatic revelation. Just ordinary people making ordinary choices, each one defensible in isolation, each one contributing to a tragedy that no one had intended. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was often how the worst harm was done. Chapter 9. When the story is finally told. Miss Marple had always believed that explanations, when they came, should be delivered with clarity but without cruelty. There was little point in understanding a situation fully if one used that understanding merely as a weapon. Truth was meant to illuminate, not to wound, though sometimes illumination itself could be painful enough, which was why on Saturday morning she once again found herself at the door of Elm Grove, requesting an audience with Mrs. Angela Fortescue. Mrs. Fortescue received her in the same drawing room as before, though this time there was a wariness in her greeting, a stiffness in her posture that suggested she had perhaps anticipated this visit and did not welcome it. "Miss Marple, how unexpected to see you again so soon. I trust you're not here about the Flower Fund once more?" "No," Miss Marple said, settling herself into the offered chair, with the deliberate movements of someone who intended to stay until she had said what needed saying. "I'm here to tell you a story. It won't take long, but I think you should hear it." Mrs. Fortescue's expression became guarded. "A story?" "Yes, about a man named Emil Kraus, who came to St. Mary Mead in February with a violin and very little else, who played beautifully at a charity concert and was admired by everyone who heard him, and who died alone in a rented room, his heart having failed under the weight of something that had nothing to do with disease." "Mr. Kraus died of natural causes," Mrs. Fortescue said, her voice controlled. "Dr. Haydock certified it himself." "Oh, the medical cause was natural enough," Miss Marple agreed. "But the circumstances that led to that natural cause were rather less so. Shall I explain how it happened?" Mrs. Fortescue said nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly on the arm of her chair. "It began," Miss Marple continued in her gentle conversational tone, "with discomfort. Mr. Kraus played too well. You see, his performance at the concert was not merely adequate or charming, it was exceptional. And that created a problem, because exceptional skill in someone without the proper credentials tends to make people uneasy. If he had been the son of a respected family, or had held a position at a conservatory, or possessed some other marker of legitimacy, his talent would have been celebrated. But he was simply a lodger at Mrs. Pritchard's, a foreigner with an uncertain past, and so his excellence became suspicious rather than admirable." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Fortescue said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I think you do. You mentioned it yourself the week after the concert, that one had to consider his background, his associations, the reasons he had left Vienna. Not because you had any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but because the absence of information felt dangerous. Better to be cautious, you said. Better to maintain a certain distance." Miss Marple paused, watching Mrs. Fortescue's face. The other woman's expression remained composed, but something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the first hint of unease. "And so the invitations were withdrawn," Miss Marple continued. "Not directly, of course. No one actually told Mr. Kraus he was unwelcome. They simply found reasons why previous plans must be altered. Mrs. Wentworth's brother visiting from Edinburgh, Colonel Bantry's concerns about the men's club, each excuse perfectly reasonable in isolation, each one contributing to a pattern of exclusion that Mr. Kraus could not fail to notice. If people chose not to socialize with Mr. Kraus, that was their prerogative," Mrs. Fortescue said stiffly. "One cannot force friendship." "No, indeed. But then came the compliments with conditions attached. The observations that he played beautifully for someone with his background, that his emotion was rather excessive in a foreign way, small qualifications that transformed praise into something rather less generous, a way of acknowledging his talent while making clear that he remained fundamentally other, fundamentally unwelcome. Mrs. Fortescue shifted slightly in her chair. I fail to see what this has to do with me. I'm coming to that, Miss Marple said patiently. You see, exclusion alone might have been survivable. Unpleasant, certainly, but endurable. But then came the whisper about Susan Price. An innocent compliment about a child's hands mentioned by the child to a friend, repeated by the friend to her mother, and somehow transformed in the retelling into something questionable. By the time you heard of it, Mrs. Fortescue, it had already acquired that quality of vague impropriety that is so difficult to dispel. I acted to protect a child, Mrs. Fortescue said, colour rising in her cheeks. Surely you cannot fault me for that. But did you? Miss Marple asked gently. Or did you act to remove a social inconvenience while telling yourself it was for the child's protection? You knew, I think, that there had been no actual misconduct. Mrs. Price told you as much when you visited her, but you suggested she cancel the violin lessons anyway, and more importantly, you advised her to maintain a dignified silence rather than correct the misunderstanding publicly. Because drawing attention to it would have made things worse. For whom? Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. Worse for Susan, who lost a talented teacher, or worse for you, who would have appeared to be defending a man you had already decided was undesirable. You knew that Mrs. Price's silence would allow the rumour to spread that people would interpret her withdrawal as confirmation of their suspicions, and you advised it anyway, because it served your purpose. Mrs. Fortescue rose from her chair, her face pale now rather than flushed. That is a monstrous accusation. Is it an accusation? Miss Marple asked. I thought I was simply describing what happened. You did advise Mrs. Price to cancel the lessons, did you not? You did suggest she remain silent about the innocent nature of Mr. Krause's comment. For the child's sake. And did the child benefit from losing her music teacher? From being caught up in a scandal that was no scandal at all? Or did she learn a rather unfortunate lesson about how reputations are destroyed and how communities protect themselves by sacrificing outsiders? The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Fortescue stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, her expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been fear. What do you want from me? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I want nothing, Miss Marple said, rising slowly to her feet. I simply wanted you to understand what you had done, not through malice. I genuinely believe you thought you were acting correctly, but through a kind of willful blindness, a determination to see danger where there was only difference, and to protect a community that needed no protection from a man who posed no threat. She moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Krause died of heart failure, as Dr. Haydock certified. But hearts fail for many reasons, Mrs. Fortescue. Sometimes they fail because the burden of isolation, of unjust accusation, of being unwanted and unwelcome becomes too heavy to bear. You didn't kill Mr. Krause, but you helped create the circumstances that killed him, and I thought you should know that. Mrs. Fortescue's face had gone completely white. That's not fair, she whispered. I was only trying to do what was right. Yes, Miss Marple said sadly. I believe you were. That's what makes it all so tragic. The worst harm is so often done by people who are trying to do what they believe is right, who have convinced themselves that their prejudices are prudence and their exclusions are protection. You meant well, Mrs. Fortescue, but Mr. Krause is just as dead. She let herself out quietly, leaving Mrs. Fortescue standing alone in her perfectly appointed drawing room, surrounded by all the markers of respectability and success, forced at last to confront the cost of her careful cruelty. Outside, the June morning was bright and warm. So Mary Mead looked peaceful, prosperous, secure in its righteousness. But Miss Marple, walking slowly home, wondered how many other Mr. Krauses had passed through this village over the years, driven away or destroyed by the same pattern of suspicious caution. How many talents had been silenced? How many lives diminished, all in the name of protecting a community that had needed no protection at all? It was, she thought, a question worth considering, though she suspected most people would prefer not to. Chapter 10, What the Violin Was Made to Say. The summer concert season arrived in St. Mary Mead with its usual predictability. Posters appeared in shop windows announcing the July charity recital at the assembly rooms, and the cultural committee met to finalise the programme. Miss Deborah Hartley would again perform Chopin. The vicar's wife had prepared a selection of Tennyson. Colonel Bantry's niece had been prevailed upon to sing something appropriate from Gilbert and Sullivan. Everything was as it had always been, as it would presumably always be. The rhythms of village life had absorbed Mr. Krause's brief presence and briefer absence with barely a ripple, like a pond accepting and forgetting a dropped stone. Miss Marple, reading the programme posted outside the draper's shop, noticed that there was no violin performance listed. She had not expected there to be one, yet the absence felt significant nonetheless, like a sentence with a crucial word missing. She mentioned this to Griselda Clement when they encountered each other at the greengrocer's on a warm Tuesday morning in early July. "Of course there's no violin," Griselda said, her voice tight with suppressed feeling. "Who would dare suggest it after what happened? It would be in poor taste, apparently, to remind people of Mr. Krause. Better to simply pretend he was never here at all." "Did someone actually say that?" Miss Marple asked, selecting tomatoes with careful attention. "Mrs. Fortescue did at the last committee meeting. Very tactfully, of course. She said that while Mr. Krause had been a talented musician, it might be best to allow some time to pass before programming violin pieces, for the sake of sensitivity." Several people nodded, as though she'd said something profound rather than something cowardly. Griselda's hands shook slightly as she examined a head of lettuce. "I wanted to stand up and tell them all exactly what they'd done, how they'd driven a good man to his death through their small-minded suspicions and their desperate need to protect themselves from anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of acceptability. But Leonard begged me not to, said it would only create division and accomplish nothing." "Your husband is probably right," Miss Marple said gently. "About it accomplishing nothing at any rate. People rarely change their minds when confronted directly. They simply become defensive and dig themselves deeper into their positions." "Then what's the point?" Griselda demanded, her voice rising slightly. "What's the point of knowing the truth if we can't speak it? What's the point of understanding what happened if nothing changes?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the point is simply to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that at least one person understands what actually occurred, even if that understanding changes nothing immediately. Seeds take time to grow, you know, and sometimes they don't grow at all, but that doesn't mean they weren't worth planting." The charity concert took place on the third Saturday in July, on an evening so perfect it seemed designed to mock the occasion with its beauty. The assembly rooms filled with their usual audience, the same faces in the same seats, the same measured applause at the same intervals. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been for decades. Miss Marple sat in her customary fourth row and watched the performances with polite attention. Miss Hartley's Chopin was as enthusiastic and inaccurate as ever. The vicar's wife's Tennyson was delivered with appropriate, trembling earnestness. Colonel Bantry's niece sang clearly, if without particular distinction. And through it all, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the evening, 3 months earlier, when Emil Krause had stood on that same platform and filled this same room with music that had been, by any honest assessment, extraordinary. She thought about how his violin had sung with such passion and precision, how his face had transformed during the performance into something both vulnerable and transcendent. And she thought about how that music, that genuine, exceptional talent, had ultimately made the village uncomfortable rather than grateful, suspicious rather than welcoming, determined to exclude rather than embrace. During the interval, she found herself approached by Mrs. Pritchard, who looked thinner than she had in the spring, and whose eyes held a perpetual sadness that had not been there before. "I've been meaning to speak with you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pritchard said quietly, "about Mr. Krauss. I found something when I was clearing out his room, and I thought perhaps you might know what should be done with it." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather notebook, worn and clearly well used. "It's his practice journal. He made notes about pieces he was working on, things he wanted to remember, and at the very end there's something else. I think he wrote it the day he died." She opened the notebook to the final page and showed it to Miss Marple. The handwriting was neat and controlled, despite the emotion the words conveyed. "Music requires two things to live, the courage to play and the willingness to listen. I had thought I could provide the first and that England would provide the second. I was wrong about England, but the music was real, even if there was no one who wished to hear it. That, at least, cannot be taken from me." Below this, in a different pen, and with a hand that seemed less steady, was a final sentence. "I am very tired of being unwelcome." Miss Marple read the words twice, feeling something tighten in her chest. Here, in these few simple lines, was the whole tragedy laid bare. Not dramatic, not sensational, just honest and unutterably sad. "What should I do with it?" Mrs. Pritchard asked, her voice catching. "Should I show it to people? Should I let them know what they did to him?" Miss Marple looked up at the woman's troubled face and made a decision. "I think," she said gently, "that you should keep it safe, and perhaps if you ever encounter another stranger in need of welcome, another person who doesn't quite fit the village's expectations, you might remember what Mr. Krauss wrote, and choose differently." Mrs. Pritchard nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I will. I promise you, Miss Marple, I will." The second half of the concert proceeded much as the first had done. More adequate performances, more polite applause, more reinforcement of the comfortable certainty that St. Mary Mead knew what it valued, and valued what it knew. But when Miss Marple walked home afterward, through streets still warm from the day's sunshine and fragrant with late roses, she found herself thinking about what had been lost. Not just one man, tragic though that was, but something larger, the possibility of being surprised by excellence, the willingness of horror to make room for those who disturbed comfortable patterns, the courage to welcome rather than exclude. She thought about how villages, like people, developed habits of thought that became harder to break with each repetition. How the impulse to protect what one had could so easily become the impulse to reject what one didn't understand. How respectability could be wielded like a weapon, while those who wielded it convinced themselves they were merely maintaining standards. And she thought about music, about how it required, as Mr. Krauss had written, both the courage to play and the willingness to listen. How true that was not just of music, but of all communication between human beings. How much was lost when people stopped listening, when they heard only what confirmed their existing suspicions and filtered out everything that might challenge their comfortable certainties. The next morning, Miss Marple cut some roses from her garden, deep red blooms that had opened perfectly despite the heat, and walked to the cemetery at the edge of the village. Mr. Krauss's grave was marked now with a simple headstone paid for by the parish. His name, the dates of his birth and death, and nothing more. No mention of Vienna, no reference to his music, nothing to suggest that he had been anything more than a temporary resident who had died of natural causes. Miss Marple placed the roses on the grave and stood quietly for a moment, thinking about all the things that could not be said on headstones, about talent that had been judged excessive, about welcome that had been withheld, and about music that had been silenced because it made people uncomfortable. "I'm really sorry," she said softly to the quiet grave. "I'm sorry we were not brave enough to listen." She walked home slowly, feeling her age more than usual, aware of how little one person could accomplish against the weight of communal certainty, but also aware understanding mattered, that bearing witness mattered, that refusing to forget mattered. The village around her looked peaceful and prosperous, settled into its summer routine with the confidence of long habit. Church bells rang the hour, children played on the green, everything appeared exactly as it should. But Miss Marple, who had learned long ago to look beneath surfaces, understood that something had been broken here that would not easily be repaired. A village that feared discomfort would always mistake silence for virtue and call it respectability. A community that could not make room for difference would always find reasons to exclude, always find ways to convince itself that exclusion was protection. And music, real music, honest music, music that spoke truth about the human heart, would always be unwelcome in such places, because truth was so often uncomfortable, and comfort was what people valued above all else.